What if I told you that the two people I loved the most in this world, my mother and my fiancé, conspired behind my back to humiliate me in a way I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy? What if I told you that the wedding dress I sewed with my own hands ended up abandoned in a closet, never worn, and soaked with tears I never thought I'd cry? My name is Evelyn May Whitaker. I'm 68 years old, and I was born and raised in a tiny town called Willow Creek, just outside Knoxville, Tennessee. It's one of those towns where everybody knows everybody, where gossip travels faster than the wind, and where you can hear the church bell ring all the way across the valley. Most people here think they know me, the quiet old woman who runs a small sewing shop, who sits on her porch, shelling peas and smiling at the children passing by. But no one really knows what I've lived through. No one knows what I had to survive. When I was young, I believed in love, like girls believe in fairy tales. I grew up imagining the day I'd walk down the aisle in white, holding my daddy's arm, hearing the whispers of awe as I made my way to the altar. I imagined a house filled with laughter, children, Sunday meals with family, kisses goodnight, and for a while, I truly believed it was all coming true. I met Raymond Lancaster when I was 21. He was tall with dark hair and the kind of smile that made girls blush. He wasn't from Willow Creek. He had moved there from Georgia to work with his uncle in construction. He stood out, spoke gently, held doors open, remembered the little things. The first time he brought me a flower, it wasn't even a rose. It was a wild daisy wrapped in a napkin from the diner. He said, "It reminded me of your laugh." I melted right then and there. Raymond was everything I thought I wanted, and Mama adored him. That should have been my first warning. My mother, Martha Whitaker, was a woman of presence, stiff posture, sharp eyes, always dressed like she was about to host a tea party, even when it was just laundry day. She had been the belle of the county in her youth and never let anyone forget it. She raised me with strict hands and even stricter expectations. I was to be polite, modest, a lady at all times. But when she smiled at Raymond, it wasn't the same smile she gave anyone else. At first I didn't notice, or maybe I chose not to. I was so in love that I brushed off every uneasy feeling as nerves. Mama had always been intense. Raymond was just being respectful. I told myself stories to silence the voice that whispered something wasn't right. We got engaged in the spring of 1979. I remember the date clearly, April 12th. He took me to the lake, knelt in the muddy grass, and pulled out a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes before he even finished asking. I ran home that evening, bursting with joy, and Mama was waiting on the porch like she already knew. She hugged me tight and whispered, "You deserve this, baby." But her grip didn't feel warm. It felt possessive, like she wasn't hugging me. She was claiming something. From that day on, something shifted in her. She started inviting Raymond over constantly, for dinner, for chores, for tea. She dressed up more than usual. She laughed louder at his jokes. She brushed his arm as she passed him things. And I pretended not to notice. Because what was the alternative? To accuse my mother of being inappropriate with my fiancé? In a town like ours? I'd be torn apart before anyone even listened. I spent months planning our wedding. I handmade the decorations, sewed my own gown. It was ivory with delicate lace I ordered by catalog. I spent hours perfecting every stitch. I wanted to feel beautiful. I wanted to feel loved. I never got to wear that dress. 1 week before the wedding, I walked into Mama's house unannounced. I had forgotten my veil. I had left it hanging in her guest room after a fitting. The door was unlocked. I walked in, humming a hymn, and then I heard it. Laughter, his laughter and hers. I stopped at the bottom of the stairs. The sound came from upstairs, from her room. I can still remember the creak of the floor beneath my feet, the way my heart started racing, the way my fingers trembled as I reached for the doorknob. I opened that door and my world collapsed. They were in bed, together, my mother, and the man I was supposed to marry in 7 days. For a second, no one moved. Raymond's eyes widened. Mama sat up, her face pale but defiant. She didn't even look ashamed. "Evelyn," she said calmly, "you should have knocked." That sentence still echoes in my head. I ran. I don't even remember how I got home. I think I screamed. I think I vomited. I tore off the ring. I ripped the wedding invitation in half. The veil, I set it on fire in the sink. And then I collapsed. For days, I didn't leave my room. I didn't eat. I didn't speak. The phone rang and rang. Mama knocked. Raymond wrote letters. I burned them all. The shame wasn't just in their betrayal, it was in the silence that followed, in the way the town whispered, in how people looked at me like I had done something wrong. No one blamed them. Not really. Mama was respected. Raymond was charming. I was just the girl who was too sensitive. I left Willow Creek 2 weeks later. I moved to Knoxville, took whatever job I could find, and disappeared from everyone I once knew. I rented a small apartment above a tailor shop and learned how to survive in silence. For years, I didn't speak of it. Not to friends, not to employers, not to anyone. But silence doesn't heal. It festers, and one day it broke. That's the story I'm here to tell. Not just the betrayal, but the journey that followed. The wounds that never fully closed. The nights I questioned my worth. The days I rebuilt myself with thread and needle, one stitch at a time. If you've made it this far, I ask you to do something from your heart. Comment below the phrase, "I will no longer apologize for surviving." That's your flag, your declaration. Like this video if you've ever been made to feel small by someone who should have protected you. Subscribe if you believe that stories like mine need to be told. Raw, painful, real. Share this video with someone who needs to remember their worth. I didn't speak to my mother for 17 years. After that night, the night I found her in bed with Raymond, I packed a small bag, took the little money I had saved from my sewing work, and left. No goodbye, no letter. I remember walking through the bus station in Knoxville like a ghost. No one looked at me. Maybe they saw the shadow behind my eyes, or maybe I was already invisible. Either way, I preferred it that way. I found a room above a hardware store on Jefferson Street. It was musty, with a leaky pipe and a window that didn't open, but it had a lock, and that was all I needed. During the first few months, I only left to buy groceries and visit the library. I didn't have friends. I didn't want them. Every time someone tried to get close, I'd retreat. I had a fear, not just of betrayal, but of being seen, of someone recognizing that I was the girl who lost everything in one cruel twist. My body was still young, but my soul had aged decades in that single night. I got a job at a laundry. The hours were long and the work hard, but folding clothes became a form of meditation. I found comfort in order, in repetition. Each crease was a way to control something, anything. No one asked questions there. No one pried. It was around that time I started writing letters I never sent. To Mama, to Raymond, to myself. I wrote things I didn't dare speak aloud. Pages and pages of anger, grief, and questions without answers. I'd burn them afterward, watching the flames eat the words like they were never real. I wish I could say I healed quickly, that I found strength and rebuilt my life like in the movies. But that would be a lie. The truth is, I spent years broken. There were mornings I couldn't get out of bed, nights I slept on the floor because the bed felt too soft, too full of memories. I had dreams, vivid, violent dreams, where I stood in front of the church altar alone, my dress stained with blood, my mother watching from the pews in silence. I hated her, but worse than that, I missed her. She was still my mother. I tried to erase that truth, but it clung to me like smoke. One day, maybe 3 years after I'd left Willow Creek, I saw her, not in person, but in a newspaper. There was a community feature on Women of the County, and there she was, smiling, holding a pie in front of her church. The article called her a pillar of grace. I laughed so hard I cried. That smile had fooled everyone. I ripped the page out and stared at it for hours. I couldn't understand how she moved on so easily. Did she think of me? Did she regret anything? Or was I just a page she'd torn from her story and tossed into the wind? The questions haunted me. It was around this time that I met Clarence, a gentle man who delivered supplies to the laundry. He had kind eyes and always brought me a sweet tea from the diner. At first I barely spoke to him, but he didn't push. He'd just smile, nod, and leave the tea on the counter. Weeks turned into months, and one day I thanked him, really thanked him, with eye contact. It felt like standing in the sun after years in the dark. He was patient, never asked about my past, never tried to fix me, just offered presence. I didn't know what to do with that. I was used to people wanting something: admiration, obedience, silence. Clarence wanted nothing but honesty. Eventually, we started walking home together, talking about books, music, the weather. He told me he used to play the guitar but gave it up after his brother died in Vietnam. I told him I used to sew wedding dresses. He didn't ask why I stopped. That was when I realized something. Not everyone needed to know my story. Not all healing required confession. Sometimes it just needed space and someone who wouldn't flinch when you cried. But despite Clarence's kindness, I still couldn't let go of what happened. The betrayal had carved itself into my bones. I'd see a wedding dress in a store window and feel nauseous. I'd smell my mother's perfume on a stranger and feel rage rise like fire in my chest. I'd hear church bells and remember that day I was supposed to walk down the aisle. Time didn't heal it. It just dulled the edges. Years passed. I changed jobs, moved apartments. Clarence stayed in my life, not as a lover, but as a friend. The kind of friend who shows up with soup when you're sick and never judges the mess on your floor. When I turned 40, he gave me a new sewing machine. "I think you're ready," he said. I didn't believe him, but I took it. That night, I threaded the needle for the first time in almost 2 decades. My hands trembled, my chest ached, but I sewed. Just a simple hem on a pillowcase. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. It was like breathing again. From there, something opened in me. I started taking small commissions, fixing pants, hemming skirts, then dresses, then gowns. I never touched wedding dresses again, though. That wound was still too raw. Through sewing, I began to feel like myself again, or maybe a new version of myself, one who knew pain intimately but refused to be defined by it. I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Lauren Bishop, and she looked nothing like the therapists in movies. She had wild curly hair, chipped nail polish, and a laugh that made you want to cry. She was the first person I ever told the full story to, from the daisy Raymond gave me to the moment I opened that door. She didn't offer easy answers, just silence when I needed it and questions when I was ready. "Why do you think your mother did it?" she asked one day. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Maybe jealousy, maybe control, maybe something in her broke a long time ago, and she couldn't stand to see me whole. But understanding her wasn't the point. Understanding me was. It's strange how the past can feel more present than the room you're standing in. There were days when I would wake up 20 years older, living in a new city, surrounded by new people, and yet I'd still feel like that girl, standing in the doorway of her mother's bedroom, frozen, gutted, undone. The scent of lavender powder and betrayal still lingered in my nose, as if time had no say in what stayed with me. Therapy with Dr. Bishop wasn't easy. In fact, it broke me in ways I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd prided myself on surviving, on being tough, on keeping my pain neatly folded and packed away, like the dresses I never finished sewing. But she unraveled that, gently, persistently, and what I found underneath wasn't strength. It was fear, shame, and guilt. So much guilt. Guilt that I hadn't seen the signs. Guilt that I had trusted them. Guilt that I had let it consume me for so long. You see, when someone betrays you like that, someone who gave birth to you, who fed you, who raised you, it doesn't just shake your trust in them. It shatters your belief in your own perception. If I was so wrong about her, what else had I been wrong about? Who else might turn on me? I began to doubt everything. Friendships, compliments, even acts of kindness. I'd search for hidden motives in the smallest gestures. Clarence noticed. Of course he did. He never asked for details, but one evening, as we sat on my porch listening to cicadas, he said something I never forgot. "You don't have to pretend you're not still bleeding just because the wound isn't fresh." I didn't answer. I just cried. And for the first time in years, I let someone hold me while I cried. Dr. Bishop encouraged me to write again. Not letters to burn, but journals to keep. I started with fragments, memories, emotions. Then came the questions, then the rage, then the sorrow. Eventually, I wrote a letter to my mother, a real one. I never sent it, but I didn't burn it either. I still have it folded inside an old hymnal. I wrote, "You didn't just steal him. You stole my belief in you, and I don't know if I can ever forgive that." It was the truest thing I had ever written. In therapy, I also talked about the church. That was a harder topic. You see, my faith was another casualty of that betrayal. My mother was a devout woman, active in the congregation, always quoting scripture, always judging others as if she spoke on behalf of heaven itself. She raised me on verses and parables, Sunday dresses and Bible study. I learned to pray before I learned to write. And yet, when she betrayed me, it felt like God had too. I stopped going to church after I left Willow Creek. I couldn't bear to hear the same hymns she sang. I couldn't sit in a pew without remembering her smile as she passed communion bread. I didn't lose my belief in God exactly, but I lost my connection to Him. It was like someone had severed the phone line, and all I heard was static. Dr. Bishop didn't push me to return to faith. She simply said, maybe it's not God you need to forgive. Maybe it's the version of him that she gave you. That sentence haunted me, because deep down, I knew she had weaponized religion against me, used it to control me, to shame me, to silence me. You must honor your mother, she'd say when I questioned her decisions. God sees rebellion, she'd whisper when I cried too loud. Forgiveness is obedience, she'd preach, even as her actions carved scars into my trust. It took me years to realize that wasn't God speaking. That was her. One evening, I gathered every Bible, every devotional, every note she'd written in the margins, and I put them in a box. Not to throw away, but to reclaim, I told myself. These words belong to me now, not to her. If I was ever going to find peace, it had to be on my own terms. That's when something changed. I started visiting an old Episcopal chapel downtown. Not every Sunday, just when I felt strong enough. The services were quieter, the people gentler. There was no fire and brimstone, no guilt, no shame, just silence, stained glass, and the soft murmur of prayer. And slowly, I began to feel something stir inside me. Not certainty, not joy, but presence. A quiet awareness that I hadn't been alone after all. I wasn't healed yet, but I was beginning to hope that healing was possible. One day, while cleaning out an old box of fabrics, I found the wedding dress I had started making all those years ago. Ivory silk, lace sleeves, a bodice I never finished. I hadn't realized I'd brought it with me when I left Willow Creek, but there it was, folded, yellowed, waiting. I sat on the floor with that dress in my lap for over an hour, and then I picked up my scissors and cut it apart, not in anger, but in release. I used the fabric to make baby blankets and donated them to the children's hospital. That dress was never meant to be worn by me, but maybe parts of it could still bring warmth, comfort, love. I didn't need it anymore. I didn't need the ghost of what could have been haunting my closet. Each stitch I made after that felt lighter. In those months, I began writing my story. This story, not for revenge or pity, but for truth. Because silence had protected everyone but me for too long, and I was done with that. I wanted to be seen, not as a victim, but as a survivor, a woman who endured, who stitched her life back together with trembling hands and unwavering courage. I didn't expect to ever see my mother again. I had built my life around her absence. Every new chapter I wrote for myself was crafted with the assumption that she would remain in the past, locked behind the door I had slammed shut so many years before. In therapy, I often spoke of her as someone already gone, not dead, but distant, erased. But life, it seems, has its own cruel sense of timing. It was the spring of 2004. I had just turned 47 and was running a small alterations business from home. The sewing machine Clarence gave me had long since been replaced by a more professional model, but I kept the old one in a corner, silent, dignified, a relic of beginnings. Business was steady. My apartment smelled of lavender and thread. I was finally, almost, at peace. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked in among utility bills and circulars. The envelope was pale blue, the handwriting unmistakable. I stared at it for a long time, unable to touch it. My hands trembled. My heart pounded like it did the night I left Willow Creek. When I finally opened it, the scent of her perfume wafted up, faint but familiar. She had written only a few lines. Dear Evelyn, I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I am dying and I would like to see you. Love always. Mama. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even feel anger. Just a deep, cold numbness that spread through my chest like frost. I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. Then I walked outside and sat on the porch for hours watching the sky shift from blue to violet. That night, I didn't sleep. Instead, I wrote in my journal. I wrote everything I felt. Confusion, betrayal, a reluctant curiosity. I didn't want to forgive her. I wasn't sure I could. But I also didn't want to carry the weight of unfinished words for the rest of my life. After 2 days, I called Dr. Bishop. I got a letter, I told her. She didn't ask from whom. She just waited. She's dying, I said. Still, no interruption, just space. I don't know what to do. Maybe you don't need to decide today, she replied. And so I waited. Weeks passed. The letter remained on my table like a ghost. I'd glance at it while folding linens or preparing meals. It didn't move, but it haunted the room. Then Clarence stopped by. He brought groceries like he often did, and while unpacking them, he saw the letter. He didn't ask, but I knew he knew. I think you're brave, he said softly, no matter what you choose. His words cracked something open in me. That night I packed a small bag and took the bus to Willow Creek for the first time in nearly 3 decades. The town hadn't changed much. The old general store still had the same crooked sign. The church steeple still pierced the sky with quiet arrogance. And my mother's house, our house, still stood on the corner of Maple and Rose. I stood outside for a long time before knocking. She opened the door herself. She looked smaller than I remembered, fragile. Her once dark hair was white, pulled into a bun like mine. Her eyes, however, hadn't changed. Still sharp, still watching. "Evelyn," she whispered, "you came." I didn't answer, just stepped inside. The house smelled the same, cinnamon and dust. I half expected Raymond to walk in from the kitchen, but of course he was gone. Married someone else, left the state. That was years ago. My mother never mentioned him in the letter, and I didn't ask. We sat in silence for a while. She brought tea. Her hands trembled. I noticed the oxygen tank near her chair, the pile of prescription bottles. She was dying. That much was clear. "I don't know how to say everything I should," she began. "Then don't," I said. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I never stopped loving you," she said. I nodded, but I didn't believe her. "What do you want from me?" I asked. She looked down. "To see you, to say I'm sorry." "Sorry for which part?" I asked. "For lying to me, for betraying me, for choosing him over me." Her shoulders shook. "For all of it," she said. And in that moment, I realized something. I had spent so long imagining this confrontation, rehearsing speeches, planning accusations, dreaming of vengeance. But now that it was here, all I felt was tired. I didn't want revenge. I wanted peace. "I can't forgive you today," I said. "Maybe not ever, but I came. That's all I can offer." She nodded slowly. "That's more than I deserve." We sat in silence again. I stayed for an hour. She showed me a box of photos, old ones. Me as a child, my father, her, before the bitterness took root. I didn't take any, but I looked, and when I stood to leave, she didn't beg me to stay. She just whispered, "Thank you." On the bus ride back, I stared out the window and cried for the first time in years. Not out of grief, but out of release. I had done what I thought I never could. I had faced the woman who broke me, and I survived it. When I told Dr. Bishop what happened, she didn't praise me. She just said, "Now the healing begins." And she was right, but healing isn't a straight road. Coming back from Willow Creek didn't feel like returning. It felt like stepping into a life that didn't quite fit anymore. The walls of my apartment, once comforting and warm, now seemed tight, like clothes a size too small. I had seen my mother for the first time in 30 years. I had heard her say, "I'm sorry." I had watched her hands shake while she poured tea, her eyes dull with sickness and regret. But no miracle had happened. I didn't feel whole. I didn't feel free. I didn't even feel strong. I felt empty. And then came the dreams. In them, I was back in that house, 17 again, walking down the hallway toward the bedroom door. Only this time, I wasn't afraid. I opened the door, and there they were. My mother and Raymond laughing, always laughing. And I would stand there screaming, but no sound came out. My feet would sink into the floor, my hands unable to reach them. Night after night, I woke drenched in sweat, gripping the sheets like they were my only anchor to this new, fragile reality. I went back to Dr. Bishop. "I thought seeing her would fix something," I told her. "It doesn't fix," she replied. "It reveals," and it did. It revealed how deep the wounds truly were, how much of my identity had been built around silence, how I had mistaken survival for healing. In the weeks that followed, I kept to myself more than usual. Even Clarence noticed. "You've been quiet," he said one evening as we sat on the porch. "I don't know who I am anymore," I confessed, and that was the truth. For so long, I had defined myself by what I'd endured, by the betrayal, the abandonment, the loss. But now that I had faced it, named it, stared it in the eye and walked away, who was I? I didn't know. So I started over. Not by moving cities or changing jobs, but by returning to the basics, by reintroducing myself to the parts of me that had been buried beneath grief and anger. I took long walks in the woods. I cooked old recipes from my grandmother's notebook. I sang while cleaning. I even planted a garden on my tiny back porch. Basil, rosemary, and a stubborn tomato vine that refused to grow straight. I didn't tell anyone, but I also started writing poetry again, not for publication, not even to show Dr. Bishop, just for me. Most of it was messy, unrhymed, raw, full of jagged lines and unfinished thoughts. But there was something liberating about pouring pain into paper without worrying about structure or sense. Some mornings I'd write for hours, sipping black coffee and listening to the clock tick. One poem I remember vividly. I buried my mother's voice in a box beneath the soil, but the roots still whisper, and I no longer tremble. That was the day I knew I was changing. Not healed, but changing. Clarence stayed in my life, patient, present, never pushing. He knew when to speak and when to sit in silence. He helped fix a leak under my sink, taught me how to check the oil in my car, brought me plums from his garden in late summer. He never kissed me, not once, and yet in his quiet way, he gave me a kind of love I had never known. Steady, safe, unspoken. One day he brought over a photo album. Inside were pictures of his parents, his childhood dog, his first truck, and finally, his late wife, Ellen. She died 12 years ago, he said softly. I haven't shown these to anyone in a long time. I didn't say anything, just looked at the images. Black and white at first, then color, then age. She was kind, he added, but she wasn't you. My heart swelled and cracked all at once, but I wasn't ready, not for that, and he understood. That fall, I received another letter. This one was from a lawyer. My mother had passed away in August, quietly, alone. She left me her house, a few pieces of jewelry, and a letter. I almost didn't read it, but I did. Evelyn, it began, if this is in your hands, then I'm no longer alive. I know I have no right to your forgiveness. I know I caused you pain I can never undo. But if there is anything left in you that remembers me as I once was, as the woman who tucked you in at night, who made blueberry pancakes on Sundays, then please accept this house as a gesture of repentance. I hope you never need it, but if you do, let it be a place of peace. I pray that God watches over you now and always. Love, Mama. I folded the letter and cried, not for her, for the little girl I once was, for the dreams she buried, for the comfort she never received. I didn't take the house. I donated it to a women's shelter in Willow Creek. They turned it into a transitional home for women leaving abusive situations. They planted a garden in the backyard, hung wind chimes on the porch. Sometimes I look at photos of the place online, and I imagine those walls, once so full of silence and shame, now echoing with laughter and second chances. That was her legacy. But mine would be different. I never thought my voice would matter to anyone. For years, I had trained myself to be silent, to carry pain like a secret folded inside my chest, tucked beneath my ribs, safe from the world's gaze. Speaking felt dangerous. Naming what had happened felt like invoking a ghost I had spent decades trying to bury. But pain doesn't disappear just because you stop naming it. It sits, it settles, it seeps into everything. The turning point came during a library event in early spring. I had been invited to a women's poetry circle by a friend from therapy. I wasn't a performer. I never intended to read. I just wanted to sit in the back and listen. The room was warm and full of women my age and older. Some carried books, others only notebooks. There were cookies on a plastic tray and tea in mismatched mugs. It felt safe until they asked for volunteers. My friend nudged me. "Read the one about the roots," she whispered. I froze. "No," I mouthed. But then another woman stood and read a poem about her son's addiction. Her voice cracked. Her hands shook, but she finished, and when she sat down, the room was silent. And then someone clapped, then another, then everyone. I don't remember standing. I only remember the paper in my hand and how it fluttered like a bird. I read, "I buried my mother's voice in a box beneath the soil, but the roots still whisper, and I no longer tremble." When I finished, no one clapped. Not at first. There was just silence, and then a woman in the front row wiped her eyes and said, "I understand." That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone. After the reading, several women approached me. One had been raised in a controlling church. Another had left an abusive husband after 20 years. A third had been estranged from her daughter for a decade. Each one thanked me, and I didn't know how to receive it. All I had done was tell the truth, but maybe that was enough. Over the following months, I began writing more intentionally. I started a blog, nothing fancy, just a place to collect thoughts and stories. I didn't use my full name, just EM, and a title, Threads of Silence. I wrote about pain, about healing, about my mother, about faith, about Clarence, who still brought me plums and fixed whatever needed fixing, about the dress I never finished, about the house I gave away. At first only a few people read it, but slowly it grew. Comments appeared. I thought I was the only one. "Your story is my story. Thank you for saying what I never could." And something shifted in me. I stopped being ashamed. I stopped whispering my truth. I started standing in it. One day, a local community center asked if I would speak at their annual women's retreat. I almost said no. The thought of standing in front of strangers terrified me. But then I remembered the woman at the poetry circle who had said, "I understand." I said yes. I prepared a speech, practiced in the mirror, rewrote it 5 times. But when the day came, I left the paper in my bag. I stood on that small stage with a microphone that hummed faintly and said, "My name is Evelyn May Whitaker. I am 61 years old, and I am a survivor." I told them about my mother, about Raymond, about Willow Creek, about the silence that nearly swallowed me. I told them about the letter, about the house, about the garden of basil and rosemary. And I watched as women nodded, cried, held each other's hands. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 22. "My stepfather did something similar," she said, "but my mom still doesn't believe me." I hugged her, not because I had answers, but because I knew the ache of being disbelieved. She cried into my shoulder, and for the first time, I felt something that had eluded me for decades. Purpose. Maybe my voice wasn't just mine anymore. Maybe it belonged to every woman who had been told to stay quiet, to forgive quickly, to move on. Maybe telling my story wasn't about me at all. Clarence was proud. "You've always had strength," he said. "Now you're letting others see it." We sat on my porch that night, listening to the wind move through the chimes. He didn't try to hold my hand. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. As the blog grew, I was invited to speak in other towns, at churches, shelters, schools. I traveled lightly, just a duffel bag and my notebooks. I always brought the first letter my mother had written me and the last. I never read them aloud, but I kept them close. They reminded me how far I had come. Not everyone liked what I said. Some church leaders called me bitter. Some accused me of slandering my family. One even wrote me an email that ended with, "A real Christian would have kept this between you and God." But I wasn't afraid anymore, because I had learned something. Silence doesn't protect the wounded. It protects the ones who did the wounding. And I refused to protect them any longer. I never thought I'd walk back into that church. For decades, the very idea of stepping through those heavy oak doors made my chest tighten. That white steeple, once so towering and majestic in my childhood, had become a symbol of betrayal. It wasn't just where I lost my innocence. It was where my silence had been blessed, endorsed, and disguised as obedience. But when the Willow Creek Women's Ministry reached out, asking if I'd come speak at their annual renewal weekend, I didn't feel fear. I felt something colder, resolve. They didn't know who I was, at least not at first. Their message had been kind, warm, generic. "We're inviting women who've lived through difficult chapters and emerged with faith intact. We've heard your voice matters." I stared at that line for a long time. My faith had never been untouched. It was bruised, cracked, tested, but it had survived, and that mattered. So I said yes. The event was scheduled for April. I packed a small suitcase, booked a modest room at the only inn in town, and made the drive alone. Clarence offered to come. But this was something I needed to face without anyone holding my hand. I arrived 2 days early. Willow Creek hadn't changed. The streets were still narrow, the sidewalks cracked. The grocery store had a new sign but the same clerk behind the counter. People still greeted each other like family, but I didn't belong. The past clung to every corner of that place. I walked past the house I grew up in. It had been painted a dull beige. The porch swing was gone, the garden overgrown. A family of 5 lived there now, judging by the toys scattered across the lawn. I stood across the street for 10 minutes watching the front door, wondering if they could feel the history in the walls. I didn't knock. The morning of the event, I dressed slowly. Navy skirt, cream blouse, sensible shoes. I braided my hair the way Mama used to before Sunday school, a strange nod to my former self. I arrived early. The sanctuary was quiet, sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows. The wooden pews gleamed, polished with care. I ran my fingers along one as I passed. Memories flooded me, sticky summer services, potluck dinners, whispered prayers, sharp glances from Mama when I fidgeted too much. The woman organizing the event greeted me kindly. "We're so honored to have you," she said. "Do you mind if we say a prayer before you begin?" I nodded. She took my hands. Her prayer was soft, simple. She asked God to open hearts, to make space for truth, to bless the words spoken today. When she said, "Amen," I took the stage. I didn't have a speech. I had my story. "My name is Evelyn May Whitaker," I began. "I was born here in Willow Creek. I grew up in the White House on the corner of Maple and Rose. Maybe some of you knew my mother. Maybe you sat beside her in these pews. Maybe you heard her voice sing hymns so sweet you forgot to listen for the dissonance. A murmur moved through the room. I'm here today, not because I survived something, but because I refused to let it define me anymore. I told them everything about Raymond, about my mother's silence, about the night I ran, about the years of therapy, about Clarence, about poetry and broken faith and the long road back to a God I could believe in again. I watched their faces, some shocked, some crying, some unreadable. I ended with this. The church is supposed to be a sanctuary, not a hiding place for secrets. If someone tells you they've been hurt, believe them. If someone says a trusted person betrayed them, don't ask what they did to deserve it. Ask how you can help them heal, because silence may feel holy, but it can be deadly. When I stepped down, there was no applause, just stillness. Then one woman stood, then another and another. A line formed. They came one by one. One woman, maybe in her 70s, gripped my hand and whispered, "I never told anyone what my uncle did to me until today." Another simply cried and hugged me. One girl, no older than 16, asked if I would talk to her mother. I stayed for hours. That night, back at the inn, I sat on the edge of the bed and wept, not out of grief, but out of awe. My pain had not been wasted. It had become a door. A month later, I received a letter from one of the women who had been in the audience. She wrote, "Your voice saved my daughter. She told me what her stepfather had done the night we returned home. I believed her. I don't know if I would have without your story. Thank you." I framed that letter, hung it above my desk. It reminds me that stories matter, not just because they're true, but because they make space for others to be true too. After Willow Creek, the invitations came more frequently. Emails, letters, phone calls. Some were from small-town libraries, others from larger conferences. A college in Georgia asked if I would speak during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. A women's shelter in Ohio requested I read my poetry to their residents. Even a podcast producer called, asking if I'd be willing to be interviewed anonymously. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a burden. I felt like I had purpose. It's strange to say that in your 60s, after decades of surviving, hiding, enduring, that you are only just beginning, but that's what it felt like. A second life, not built on denial but on truth. Still, there were days the silence crept back in, mornings when I woke up and felt the old ache in my chest, nights when the dreams returned, softer now, but still potent. There were times I questioned my own voice. Was I exaggerating, misremembering? Had I given Raymond too much space in my mind? But then I'd read another letter. I thought I was alone. I watched your talk and cried for hours. My daughter said she could finally breathe after hearing you. Those voices stitched me back together. I decided to do more. With the small inheritance I had kept from my mother, mostly untouched, I started something small, the Rooted Foundation. It wasn't much at first, just me, a part-time assistant named Teresa, who was fresh out of college, and a rented office space above a florist shop in Nashville. Our goal was simple: to provide resources for women over 50 who had survived childhood abuse and had never spoken about it, because I had learned something brutal. So many women my age had never told a soul. They carried their trauma like old suitcases, tucked under beds, hidden behind polite smiles and church casseroles. They raised families, worked jobs, cared for others, and never dared name the thing that nearly destroyed them. We hosted writing circles, healing retreats, one-on-one therapy referrals. I collaborated with Dr. Bishop and a few other trusted professionals who understood that healing at 60 or 70 or even 80 wasn't too late. It was urgent. Our first retreat was held at a borrowed lake house. 15 women attended. They were from Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi. One had been a school teacher, another a retired nurse. One woman, 83, arrived in silence and didn't speak until the last day. When she did, her voice trembled like paper. "I thought I would die with this," she whispered, "but I don't want to." She didn't. She lived 3 more years, and during that time, she wrote her story. She read it aloud to her granddaughter. She died with peace in her eyes. That's when I understood. Our stories are not weights. They're seeds. What grows from them depends on when, how, and where we plant them. The Rooted Foundation grew slowly but steadily. Donations came in from unexpected places. A woman from Michigan sent us a check for $2,000 with a note that read, "You gave me my voice. I want you to give it to someone else now." We partnered with local churches. Not all were supportive, but some were brave enough to open their doors. I only worked with those who agreed to honest conversation. not protection of image. And yes, there was resistance. Some communities saw us as dangerous. She's just dredging up the past, one pastor said of me. No good can come from reopening wounds God already healed. But I wasn't reopening wounds. I was tending to the ones never treated. One day, a group of young women from a local college invited me to join a panel. They were studying intergenerational trauma and wanted my perspective. I sat beside two other survivors, both under 30, and we compared stories. What struck me wasn't how different we were. It was how similar, decades apart. Different towns, different abusers, and still the same tactics, the same fear, the same forced silence. Afterward, a student asked me, if you could go back, would you have told someone sooner? I looked at her and I told the truth. No, I wasn't safe back then. Not with my mother, not with that church, not with anyone. But I would have told myself this: you're not crazy, you're not dirty, and you will survive. And maybe that's why I do this, because someone needs to hear that today. Clarence helped wherever he could. He built a bookshelf for our office, repaired a broken stair at the retreat house, drove women to therapy when no one else could. He never asked for anything in return. One evening, as we locked up the office, he turned to me and said, I know we've danced around this for years, but if I were to ask if I could hold your hand right now, would that be okay? I didn't answer. I just reached out and held his. It was the gentlest yes I've ever given. I wasn't looking for it. By then, my mother had been gone for over a year, and I had made peace with the things she never said. I had accepted that we would never have the conversations I needed, that her silence wasn't mine to break, that some apologies die in the throat. But grief is a strange thing. It doesn't move in straight lines. It lingers in curtains, in recipes, in the cadence of a hymn you haven't sung in decades. I was in the attic, looking for an old photo album for the Rooted Foundation's newsletter. I found a box I hadn't opened since her funeral. It was labeled Sunday School, 1960s. Inside were old lesson plans, worn Bibles, bulletins yellowed with time, and tucked inside the front flap of her King James Bible was an envelope. My name was on it, just Evelyn. It was her handwriting. I sat down, the weight of the Bible in my lap, the envelope trembling in my hands. I stared at it for minutes before I opened it, wondering if I even wanted to read what was inside. What if it was more excuses, more scripture used as shields? But I needed to know. I unfolded the paper. It was dated 8 months before she died, written in blue ink, every word tight, deliberate, like she'd prayed between each line. Evelyn, if you found this, then I'm gone. I won't ask forgiveness because I don't deserve it. But I will ask you to read this with the heart of the woman you've become, not the girl I failed to protect. I knew about Raymond, not everything, but enough. I saw bruises once, and you lied. I told myself you were clumsy. I chose not to ask again. I chose silence. The church was my refuge, and I feared that if I acknowledged what I saw, that refuge would collapse. I was weak. I told myself I was being faithful, but really, I was afraid of the cost. You deserved better. I wish I could say I loved you well. I loved you deeply, but not well. And love that does not protect is not worthy of the name. If I could do it all again, I would burn down the house before I let him touch you again. But I didn't. And that shame has lived inside me every day. I've read your blog, all of it. I printed the poem about roots and kept it in my drawer. I've watched your talks online. I sit at the back of the sanctuary when no one is there and replay your words in my head. You are braver than I ever was, and you are right. Silence is not holy. I pray God welcomes me despite what I failed to do. And I pray He blesses you for doing what I never could. I love you. Mama, I read it twice, then 3 more times. I sobbed until my chest ached. I didn't know how to feel. Anger, relief, sadness, validation. I had spent years building my healing without her words. I had learned to live without her apology. I had become strong without her shield. And yet, there it was. Proof that she saw, that she knew, that she didn't stop it, that she regretted it. I hated how much I needed it, and I hated that it was too late. Still, something cracked open in me. A dam I didn't know was still holding. I brought the letter to therapy. Dr. Bishop sat in silence as I read it aloud. When I finished, he asked, "What do you want to do with it?" "I don't know." "Do you believe her?" "I do." "Then maybe the work isn't about getting her to say it. Maybe it's about what you do now that she has." So I wrote her back. I wrote a letter I would never send. I wrote, "I am not who I am because of what you didn't do. I am who I am because I chose to speak anyway. But I want you to know, I would have forgiven you, not because you deserved it, but because I needed to stop carrying your shame." I folded that letter and placed it inside the back of her Bible, and I closed it. Closure isn't a door that locks. It's a window cracked open just enough to let in the air. That fall, I shared the story of the letter at a national women's conference in St. Louis. Over 2,000 women sat in that auditorium. When I read my mother's words, the room went still. I ended with this: some apologies will never come, but healing doesn't wait for permission. You don't need their words to reclaim your own. Afterward, a woman approached me. She held out a photograph. It was of her and her mother. She died last year. I was waiting for a letter like yours. It never came. I squeezed her hand. Then write your own, I said. Let her ghost know you're no longer asking. Sometimes we write the endings we never got. Sometimes that's enough.